Man opened a mysterious envelope at midnight, and his life was never the same again. Daniel walked alone through the dimly lit alley, the soft hum of the city in the background. His heart raced as he checked his phone. 12:01 a.m. He was on time, but he still wasn't sure why he had come. The text message he'd received earlier was strange, cryptic. "I have a proposal that could change your life. Midnight, 3rd Street. Come alone." Daniel, a man living in the dull routine of office life, couldn't shake the curiosity gnawing at him. The monotony of his daily existence had begun to feel suffocating, like he was simply going through the motions. And so, when the message appeared, something deep inside him, something dormant, stirred. Could this be the chance to break free? His footsteps echoed off the brick walls as he moved deeper into the darkness, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a storm cloud. His breath was shallow, his mind racing with every possibility, every dangerous thought. At the far end of the alley, a tall figure stood under the flickering streetlight, motionless, waiting. "Daniel!" The figure called out, his voice smooth but unsettling. It was as if he had been expecting Daniel all along, like the meeting was fated, inevitable. Daniel swallowed hard. "That's me." The man stepped forward, his face partially obscured by shadows, and for a brief moment Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unnerving about this stranger, something that made every instinct in his body scream to turn and flee. But his feet remained rooted, his curiosity too powerful to resist. "I know you've been searching for something different," the man said, his words wrapped in mystery, a knowing edge to his voice. "I have an offer for you, but it comes with a price." Daniel's chest tightened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. The man ignored the question and pulled out a black envelope from his coat, its sleek surface gleaming ominously under the dim light. "This holds the key to your new life. Take it. But understand, once you open it, there's no going back." The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the world had stopped just for this moment, waiting. Daniel hesitated. His life was predictable, yes, but it was safe. Everything was safe. Too safe. But this was a chance to step out of the cage, to break free from the dull routine, and take hold of something greater, something unknown. The unknown was terrifying, but it also called to him, beckoning him like a siren's song. His fingers trembled as he reached out, his hand inching toward the envelope. He could feel the weight of the decision in his bones. The man's eyes bore into him, silent but expectant. For a fleeting second, Daniel wondered if he was making a mistake, if he was about to walk down a path that would undo everything he knew. But before he could stop himself, his hand closed around the envelope. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. It was cold, almost mocking. "Remember, once you open it, everything changes." Without another word, the man turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The air seemed to settle, and Daniel stood alone in the alley, the envelope heavy in his hand. He stared at it, knowing that with one simple action, his entire life could be turned upside down. What would Daniel do next? Could he really change his life, or was this just the beginning of something far darker? The unknown loomed large, and there was no turning back. The tension hung in the air, thick and palpable, as the echoes of the night swallowed him whole. Back at his cramped apartment, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, the weight of the black envelope heavy in his hands. The dim light from the single lamp flickered above him, casting soft, uneven shadows on the cluttered room. His breath came in shallow bursts as his mind raced with questions. What could possibly be inside that would change his life? Was this some sort of twisted game? Or a joke? He stared at the envelope, trying to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to add up. The cryptic words from the stranger echoed in his mind. Once you open it, everything changes. His fingers trembled as he tore open the envelope, the paper crinkling under the pressure. He pulled out a single sheet, crisp and pristine, with nothing written on it except for one thing: a phone number at the bottom. It was blank. Daniel blinked, his confusion deepening. Was this some sort of test? A puzzle? There were no instructions, no context, just the number, small, neat, and purposeful, printed in a calm, meticulous handwriting that seemed out of place in the context of everything else. For a moment, his mind went blank, trying to process the sudden shift in reality. Was this a message? A riddle? Or was he being played? He leaned back against the wall, the apartment around him feeling suddenly smaller, more suffocating. The weight of his mundane life, his soul-crushing job, the endless routine, the feeling of being invisible, pressed on him. He thought about what was at stake. Could he really walk away from everything? He had spent so long trapped in his own predictable world, barely scraping by, that this strange moment seemed like a doorway to something more, something different. With a deep, uncertain breath, Daniel picked up his phone. The digits of the number seemed to burn into his eyes as he hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if it led to something dangerous? What if it was a scam? Or worse, a trap? He could just throw it away and forget this madness. He could go back to his ordinary life just like before. But the thought of staying in that lifeless routine gnawed at him. He couldn't. Not anymore. The longing for something more, something meaningful, outweighed the fear that gripped him. He dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice. The silence stretched, heavy and unnerving, like a pause in time itself. Then, after a third ring, there was a sharp click, the sound of someone picking up. "We've been expecting your call," a woman's voice answered smoothly, as if reading from a script. Her tone was calm, calculated, detached, and it sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It was as if this moment had been preordained, as if everything that had led him here was part of some grand design he couldn't yet comprehend. Daniel's pulse quickened. "What decision? Who is this?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, a mix of disbelief and fear. His mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. Was he being watched? Had they planned for this all along? But before he could ask another question, there was a sharp click. The line went dead. Daniel sat in the silence, staring at the phone in his hand, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. His heart hammered in his chest, the room around him spinning. What had just happened? What decision had already been made? The room felt colder. The walls seemed to close in, and Daniel realized with a terrifying certainty that there was no going back now. Something had been set into motion, and there was no stopping it. For days, nothing happened. Daniel tried to convince himself it was just a weird encounter, a strange coincidence, a moment of misplaced curiosity. Life returned to its mundane rhythm. He woke up early, rode the crowded subway to work, sat at his cubicle, and went home to his tiny apartment each evening. Yet, the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, that eerie encounter with the mysterious man, the phone call, the cryptic message, none of it seemed like it could just disappear. There were nights when Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would happen next. Was it a mistake to open the envelope? To make that call? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. But as the days passed, the feeling seemed to fade into the background. Maybe it had all been a joke. Maybe he'd just imagined the weight of it all. But deep down, something inside him remained uneasy, as though the calm before a storm was stretching on too long. Then one morning it happened. As Daniel stepped out of his apartment building, his gaze was drawn to something that didn't belong. A sleek black car, the kind that looked straight out of a spy thriller, was parked across the street. Its polished surface gleamed in the early morning sun, casting long, dark reflections on the sidewalk. The car's tinted windows gave it an air of mystery, but what caught Daniel's attention more than anything was the man standing beside it. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, and the one Daniel had encountered in the alley. His smile was unmistakably the same. Cold, calculated, and unsettling. Sensation in his eyes. "Mr. Daniels," the man said smoothly, his voice carrying a strange authority. "Please, come with me." Before Daniel could react, before he could even fully process what was happening, the man opened the car door and gestured for him to get in. The tension in the air was thick with unspoken pressure, and without a word, Daniel found himself stepping into the car, his legs feeling heavy, almost unwilling to move. The interior of the car was everything Daniel had not expected. Luxurious, sleek, with plush leather seats that seemed too soft, too inviting. The windows were dark tinted, making it impossible to see outside. The feeling inside was surreal, as if he had been transported into a different world, one where the rules no longer applied. The air was stifling, and despite the comfort, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of confinement, as though the car itself were a prison. The silence between them was deafening. The man didn't say a word as he slid into the seat beside him, his eerie smile never wavering. The driver, a silent figure in the front, didn't even acknowledge Daniel's presence. His face was hidden by the rearview mirror, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, unmoving. The car began to move, weaving effortlessly through the city streets, but Daniel didn't feel the sense of freedom he usually did when he traveled. Instead, the feeling of being trapped in a controlled environment, an environment he had no control over, began to settle over him like a dark cloud. "I didn't agree to anything," Daniel finally muttered, his voice low, barely audible over the hum of the engine. His throat felt dry, his heart racing in his chest. "I didn't sign up for this." The man beside him didn't even flinch. His eyes remained fixed forward, but his lips curved into a slight, knowing smile. "You did, the moment you opened the envelope," he replied, his tone eerily calm. "Your life belongs to us now." Daniel's stomach dropped. The words echoed in his mind, each one like a weight pressing down on him. "Your life belongs to us now." It was a sentence with no escape, no way out, and the realization that he was now tangled in something far larger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined began to consume him. The city outside the dark windows blurred past, but it felt like a dream, like Daniel wasn't really there. His mind raced, the horror of the situation creeping in, yet he couldn't look away. He had crossed a line the moment he opened that envelope, and now, whatever game he had unknowingly signed up for had already begun, and it was too late to turn back. The black car finally came to a stop in front of a towering skyscraper that loomed against the grey skyline. The building's glass facade reflected the dimming light of the evening sky, but the windows themselves were dark and foreboding, offering no hint of what lay inside. The sleek, modern architecture seemed out of place in the city's typical hustle and bustle, and its silent, imposing presence sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, one that led to an unknown and dangerous world. The car doors opened, and without a word, the man in the dark suit gestured for Daniel to step out. His movements were mechanical, as if everything was preordained. With his heart pounding, Daniel followed him up the steps into the building, his footsteps echoing in the vast sterile lobby. The air was unnaturally cool, and the fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, as if the place itself was alive, watching him. They passed through a series of sleek, empty corridors, each more polished and modern than the last. The walls gleamed under the sharp lighting, and the silence seemed oppressive. Each turn Daniel made felt deliberate, as if he was being led through a maze. His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. The very architecture of the building felt like it was closing in on him, each hallway a step deeper into the unknown. Finally, they arrived at a large metallic door, which slid open with a soft hiss. Daniel was ushered inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The room was cavernous, almost clinical in its cold design. The walls were lined with massive screens, all showing different images of people, ordinary people, going about their lives, unaware they were being watched. Some were laughing, others in deep conversation, a few sitting in solitude. Each of them, living their lives in complete oblivion, was being monitored, their every move captured in real time. At the center of the room stood a woman, tall and poised, her features sharp and commanding. Her eyes were piercing, cold, yet oddly magnetic. She wore a tailored black suit, her hair slicked back into a no-nonsense bun. Her presence radiated power and control. The air around her seemed to thrum with a quiet, intense energy, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that she was the one pulling the strings. "Welcome, Daniel," she said with a cold, almost mocking smile, her voice smooth and deliberate. "You've been chosen for something bigger. Your life as you knew it is over. You now work for us." Daniel's blood ran cold, and for a moment he couldn't move or speak. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating him. He opened his mouth to respond, but his throat felt dry. "Who were you people?" he finally managed, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "What do you want from me?" The woman's smile didn't waver, but her eyes seemed to gleam with dark satisfaction. "We run an experiment, Daniel," she said, her tone almost matter-of-fact. "One that tests the boundaries of free will and consequence. Every choice you make from now on will be monitored, controlled, and influenced. Your decisions will shape the lives of others. It's a game, but with real stakes." The room seemed to spin as Daniel's mind raced, trying to grasp what she was saying. "You can't just control my life like this," he shouted, his voice rising with desperation. "I didn't sign up for any of this." The woman's smile faded, her expression now cold and resolute. "You did, the moment you called the number," she said, her words final. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he realized the full weight of her statement. There was no going back. His fate, and the fate of others, was now out of his hands, trapped in this twisted game. Daniel's life had become a waking nightmare. What had once been a predictable existence, work, friends, a routine, was now nothing but a series of calculated decisions, each one more suffocating than the last. Every action he took was watched, followed, and scrutinized by unseen eyes. Every glance, every word he spoke, seemed to echo back at him as if trapped in a never-ending feedback loop. No matter where he went, the feeling of being observed never left. It was as if his every move had been anticipated, and any attempt to break free from the invisible chains around him only led to harsher consequences. The first of these consequences came swiftly. One day, Daniel arrived at his office to find that his position had been terminated without explanation. His boss, a usually friendly figure, couldn't meet his eyes as he handed over the severance papers. "Sorry, Daniel, but we've made some changes. Effective immediately." No explanation, no reason. The same happened with his friendships. People he had known for years seemed to distance themselves, their messages growing sparse and cold. Conversations that once felt familiar and comforting now felt forced and artificial. It was as though an unseen force had quietly manipulated them, pulling them away from him with invisible strings. He tried to defy the system, to break free, but each attempt was met with swift and harsh repercussions. Every decision he made, every attempt to regain control over his life, felt like it was part of a cruel game. He was trapped in a world where nothing was real, where the line between freedom and manipulation blurred with every passing day. In the sterile, oppressive room, the screens never stopped showing glimpses of other people, people who had been chosen for this experiment, like him. Some thrived, navigating the twisted rules of the game with cunning and precision. Their lives appeared to flourish, each decision carefully calculated to keep them in the game. But for others, their screens would suddenly go black, their lives vanishing without a trace. There was no warning, no explanation. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, erased from existence as though they had never been. Daniel's stomach churned as he watched these disappearances, his mind racing with questions. What happened to those who vanished? Were they punished, or worse, wiped from existence? He couldn't understand the rules of the game, and that made him feel even more powerless. One day, in a moment of desperation, Daniel found himself in front of the woman again, the same cold, commanding figure who had welcomed him into this nightmare. She stood before him, watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. He had to know. "Is there a way out?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear and frustration. "Is there any way to escape this, to live my life again?" The woman's piercing gaze never wavered, her lips curling into a thin, emotionless smile. "That depends on you," she replied, her tone as cold and detached as ever. "If you can survive long enough, you may find your freedom again. But every choice has consequences, Daniel. Choose wisely." Her words hung in the air like a chilling warning, each one heavy with the weight of the game's unseen rules. Daniel's mind raced. Survival? Was that all he could hope for now? Just to outlast the game's twisted trials and find a way to escape? He didn't know how much longer he could take it, but the thought of freedom? The idea of regaining control over his life kept him going. However, with each passing day, the stakes grew higher, the consequences more severe, and the path to freedom more elusive. In the cold, sterile room with the ever-watching screens, Daniel realized one horrifying truth. His life had become nothing more than a game. And the rules? They were written by someone else. As the days stretched into weeks, Daniel felt the walls of his life closing in, tighter and tighter. The decisions he once made instinctively now felt foreign, as if they were being dictated by some unseen force. His every move was watched, monitored, and manipulated. Each time he tried to make a choice that was his own, there was a quiet, unsettling shift, a subtle pull, like invisible strings tugging at him, guiding him down paths he hadn't chosen. It was as if he were a puppet, his every action controlled by the organization that had ensnared him. The feeling of losing himself became unbearable. Daniel was no longer in control of his own life. Whether it was the clothes he wore, the people he interacted with, or even the way he spent his time, it all seemed preordained by the hidden force behind the screens. Every decision he made, even those that seemed small or inconsequential, ripples of change that extended beyond his own life. Strangers he had never met were affected by his choices, unseen lives twisted and altered by his every action, and all of it under the watchful eyes of those behind the screens. His world had become a maze, and the more he tried to navigate it, the more he realized how trapped he was. The weight of every choice pressed down on him, making even the most mundane decisions feel like life or death matters. The deeper he went, the more the game revealed its true nature. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his life. This was bigger, far more complex than he had ever imagined. His actions weren't just affecting him. They were influencing the lives of people he would never know, people he would never meet, all while the shadowy figures behind the screens watched it all unfold. The fear of making a wrong move gnawed at him. Could he outsmart them? Could he reclaim control over his life, or was he doomed to be a mere pawn, trapped in a game where the rules were constantly changing and the consequences were all too real? With each passing day, Daniel's hope for freedom grew more distant. The walls around him seemed to shift, closing in tighter, making escape feel impossible. He wasn't sure if he could survive much longer in a world where every decision had already been made for him. Yet the thought of surrendering, of giving up and letting them win, felt even worse. His mind raced with questions, but every answer seemed to lead him deeper into the maze. Was there any way out, or had he already passed the point of no return? One night, when the silence of his apartment felt unbearable, Daniel's phone buzzed once more. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the message. "This is your last chance. One choice remains. Freedom or control. No further details, no instructions, no explanation. Just a simple, chilling ultimatum." The words lingered in his mind, echoing like a drumbeat in his chest. Daniel's mind raced. What did it mean? What was the right choice, and what would happen if he chose wrong? His stomach churned with the thought of the consequences, but the feeling of suffocating under someone else's control, of being manipulated with every step, was worse. Every day, every moment felt like a test he never signed up for. His thoughts were clouded with fear, uncertainty, and desperation. The weight of the situation was unbearable, and yet there was no escape. He realized in that moment that his entire life, every interaction, every decision, even his very existence, had been orchestrated. Every move he made was calculated by the organization behind the screens. The job he lost, the friends who turned cold, the strange encounters, and even the brief sense of freedom he'd felt were all part of a game, a test of some kind. Daniel had become a puppet in a twisted experiment with no one to turn to, no allies left. The people he once knew were either gone or manipulated beyond recognition. The isolation was all-consuming. The weight of this realization bore down on him as he stood in front of the room of screens once again. The same cold metallic walls, the same flickering emotionless faces of strangers and colleagues, all watched over by the unseen figures who controlled his every move. The screens displayed images of the lives of others, their paths shifting according to his decisions. Some were thriving, others suffering, each one a reflection of his own choices, yet none of them truly his to make. This decision, he knew, was different. This one wasn't just about him. It wasn't just his life hanging in the balance. It was about something bigger, perhaps the future of others too. Every choice he made had consequences, but this last one, this final choice, would define everything. Would it be freedom, a return to his own control, or would he forever be bound by the unseen hands that had shaped his life? Daniel stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume him. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in as he realized the stakes, his future, the futures of those around him. Everything would change with this choice. He couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. With one final, trembling breath, Daniel reached out and made his decision. In that moment, he understood one thing. This choice would either set him free or bind him to a fate he could never escape. But whatever happened, this was the last chance he'd ever have to take control of his life. The screens, once buzzing with constant activity, went completely dark. The sudden absence of light and movement left Daniel in a suffocating silence. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat sounding louder than the last as he stood motionless in the middle of the room. The weight of his decision hung heavily in the air, and his mind raced with questions that had no answers. Had he chosen freedom, or had he just sealed his fate by falling deeper into that trap? For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. The stillness seemed unnatural, oppressive. His thoughts spiraled out of control, second-guessing everything he had done. What if there was no right answer? What if, in the end, he had never truly had a choice at all? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and his breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Then the silence was broken by a soft click, a mechanical sound that seemed to reverberate throughout the room. Daniel turned, his eyes wide, his body tense, expecting to see something, anything. And there she was, the woman, the same cold figure who had watched over him all this time, stood in front of him once again. Her presence was as chilling as ever, her sharp features illuminated by the dim light that now filled the room. "Well done, Daniel," she said, her voice as smooth and emotionless as ever, but colder, more detached than before. The words sent a shiver down his spine. "You've made your choice. Now, live with the consequences." Before he could respond, before he could even process what she had said, the woman vanished again, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared. Daniel was left alone, his mind reeling with the weight of her words. It was then, standing in the now quiet room, that the crushing reality hit him. There was no escape. Freedom was nothing more than an illusion. A fleeting hope dangled in front of him like a carrot on a string. No matter what choice he had made, no matter how hard he tried to break free, he was forever bound to the game. The rules had never truly been his to define. Every step he took, every decision he made, had been carefully planned, carefully manipulated by the organization that controlled his life. The finality of it all settled over him like a heavy fog. He had been playing their game all along, unaware, naive, thinking that he could somehow win, but the truth was undeniable. He was just another pawn, another piece in a game that had no end, no redemption. Freedom was a lie, and now, more than ever, Daniel understood that there was no way out, only the game. If you want to see how far this story goes and discover more mind-bending twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next on Join Williams' Wisdom Stories.